This is a really exciting project that was done. Your program lists Rick Newby, who is the editor of the Drumlin Institute, or the director and editor-in-chief. However, he's ill today, and Chere Jiusto will be stepping in as moderator for this session. Chere is the executive director of the Montana Preservation Alliance, who was a partner on this endeavor. And she's an artist and a historian and a preservationist and a woman who makes it happen. So we're happy to have her here. Brian Shovers has been a reference historian and more recently director of the library at the Montana Historical Society for the past 16 years. His education includes a master's in history from Montana State University and an MLS in library science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He lived in Butte for the decade of the 1980s, where he served as president of the Butte Historical Society and editor of The Speculator, a journal published by the Butte Historical Society. He's written a number of articles on Butte's industrial past for Montana, the magazine of Western history. Since 1998, he served as president of the Montana chapter of the Society for Industrial Archaeology, an organization of about 50 members dedicated to the preservation and interpretation of industrial history. And it's a fascinating group, so see him if you want to be a member. The 20-year-old organization sponsors 2 tours each year and has explored things like working gold mines and mills, plywood plants and sugar beet plants and dams and all sorts of things, so they're an active group. Patty Dean received her A.B. in History from Carroll College and an M.A. in History Museum Studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program, State University of New York. In the early 80s, she was curator of collections at the Montana Historical Society and later founding curator of the Arkansas Arts Center Decorative Arts Museum in Little Rock. Patty worked at the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul for 16 years, first as museum collections manager and later as supervisory curator. As an independent public historian in Helena from 2005-2008, she was an adjunct faculty for the history and music departments at Carroll College and a historian for the Montana Historical Society's Identifying African Americans in Montana Heritage Resources project. Since December of last year, she's been the curator of history at the Montana Historical Society. She serves as a board commission member for Montana Preservation Alliance, Drumlin Institute, Helena, Lewis and Clark County Historic Preservation Commission, and the Montana Heritage Commission. And we do have to tell you that it's incestuous up here, so we all work at the Montana Historical Society, or have. So welcome everyone, and we're looking forward to hearing about Butte.
Thanks, Sue. And I hope it's okay if I sit down during my introduction. I'm Chere Jiusto, and I am impersonating Rick Newby today, although that is sort of hard to do. We're really sorry that Rick cannot be here, and I'd just like to say that, you know, he's such a force in the intellectual life of Montana and in the literature of the poetry and the writing in our state. I think, you know, there are not many who really kind of have dedicated their life to the world of letters like Rick has for Montana. Is this loud enough? Can you hear me better now? Okay. I'm the executive director of the Montana Preservation Alliance, and our mission is to save and protect Montana's historic places, traditional landscapes, and cultural heritage. And that really spans a pretty big set of responsibilities, but it also gives us lots of flexibility to take creative projects and run with them. And we were really delighted to partner with the Drumlin Institute that Rick founded a few years back to present a collection of scholarly writings on the cultural landscape of Butte and Anaconda, the sister copper cities of southwestern Montana, in a way that really brought a lot of new information to light and shed new scholarship on a number of questions relating to the history of the cities and the environment and the culture of the towns. The idea for this project really took hold initially through a series of discussions that had to do with the Vernacular Architecture Forum that was going to be touring Montana this year, and actually they were here in June. And in preparation for that tour, the Montana Preservation Alliance and others, Rick and Patty, were part of a discussion group 2 or 3 years leading into this tour group, and decided, that there were some ideas floating about doing a guidebook, some kind of publication that would welcome the people of the Vernacular Architecture Forum, but also be a lasting product after the tour had come and gone, and something that had some kind of lasting impact and established a legacy. And as we talked about it, the idea of a guidebook kind of came and went, and for our purposes, we started talking about doing something on contemporary scholarship, new research that was being done, and so the idea blossomed into a book that was focused on Butte and Anaconda, and it's really in a lot of ways kind of much farther reaching. It wraps together the historic built environment of these two communities, but also the landscape as a cultural expression, and the icons of Butte and Anaconda as a framework against which the cultures of these communities really present, kind of a very unique and unusual industrial kind of habitat. And so the book incorporates research about specific historic buildings or places, and it also incorporates artistic expression, photography, artwork that was inspired by these two communities. Drumlin Institute is an organization that does most of its work online, and the work that Rick does to bring contemporary scholarship to the public is really kind of innovative. He publishes the Drumlin Views as an online journal. It's free and available to the public. Anyone who wants to Google up Drumlin Institute can look at all the issues that have been published since the organization was founded. And it's really eclectic. A lot of the issues just are Rick's look at what's happening now and what's interesting and new. And a lot of the topics are really provocative, just kind of some ideas that he comes up with by knowing people in these fields, by really being in the inner circles with a lot of writers and scholars and historians, and then putting online their expression of the research they're doing and what's new in Montana journalism. And so our project to partner with Rick really took a look at Butte and Anaconda in a way that could provide a new sort of direction to some of the ways that the communities had traditionally been interpreted. We partnered together, and then we brought the proposal to such organizations as the National Park Service, Humanities Montana, and the State Historic Preservation Office. And all three of these organizations gave us funding support for the project and encouraged the work of all the writers who were incorporated to really be brought to the public. The National Park Service made it possible to not only bring the scholarship together, but also to then publish in hard copy all of the work that was done. And so you have the choice with this publication to either go online and download all 400 pages, or you can look for the book itself, and it's really a wonderful collection of writing and scholarship that people can have access to and put on the bookshelf. And so the Challenge Cost Share program out of the regional offices of the Park Service funded this, and we were able to then subsidize the publication to do the hard copy. And this is the first time that Drumlin has actually taken their online journal and been able to put it out in hard copy as well. So as we did this, it was really wonderful to approach a number of artists and writers and historians and anthropologists and scholars who all contributed freely to the content of the journal. And Patty Dean, who you'll hear from next, was the guest editor. She did a tremendous job of seeking out people with lots of new writing to offer and lots of new perspectives. And then she also talked to everybody who was an author along the way to kind of help them shape their essays and think about how the essays could complement one another. And in the end, it's really just a tremendously powerful look at these communities and something that offers something new for the reader. I'd like to turn it over to Patty because she is the one who really spearheaded all of the coordination and the scholarly overview of the project. And then along with Patty, we have Brian Childers, who's such a long-time historian on the communities of Butte and the built environment there, that it will be really interesting to hear from him about how his essay came together and how it's rooted in many years of research and actually residence down in those two cities. So, Patty?
Thanks a lot, Cher. I'm going to be a bit befuddled today because I have a head cold, so I won't breathe beyond this table. So hopefully I'll make sense and you can hear me okay, and I won't cough too much either. It was a really great opportunity to work with my old friends Cher and Rick on, I think, what can best be described as a glorious tangle of stories about Butte and Anaconda. Actually, I should switch over here to the thing. Hello. Oh, there I am. They're such both powerful presences, and they have almost, I guess you could say, sort of a cubistic manifestation, because you can look at them in so many different ways. And that was at once the great delight, but at the same time challenge in trying to document and interpret these two very important international urban places that happen to be in Montana. And I think the words of George Wesley Davis, who was an early 20th century essayist, wrote a great little book about Butte called Sketches of Butte, which I think actually I ran across on Google Books. But he wrote, "There is tragedy and romance in the very look of the place, and one's breath comes quickly." And that is exactly what we were trying to do with this, was to introduce new aspects of Butte and Anaconda to people who were familiar with the stories, familiar with the people, but at the same time also introduce a different perspective to those people who did not know it. And we were thinking, as Cher alluded to, of our audience with the Vernacular Architecture Forum, which I've been a member of for a number of years. It's actually an international group of preservationists, historic architects, a lot of academics, and then people who are just interested in material culture, which are the things that we surround ourselves with in our daily lives. And so we needed to be able to introduce that concept to them as well. And at the same time, these two places are some of the most scrutinized and documented of any Montana places, any places in Montana. And so our challenge was to, like I said, identify new works, or works that had either been forgotten or overlooked or what have you, and bring those out to the public eye, both virtually and then also in the printed edition. Oh, I should add too that the images online and in the book are much more clear than these. What happened was, when Rick called me last night and said he wasn't going to be able to make it, I thought I had the CDs with the actual images at my house, but I'd given them to him. So what I had to do was paste PDFs from the online version into this. So the actual images are much more clear, and I apologize that these are kind of blurry, but that's why. So the book was fun to work on too, because we were able to approach old friends of ours like Carol Van West, who is now the head of the Center for Historic Preservation at Middle Tennessee State University. with assignments in trying to set the stage for us. And in the early 80s, Van, as he's known, had worked for the State Historic Preservation Office in devising a master plan of the state. And he's returned to Montana continually over the past 25 years to assess how things have changed here and how things have not changed. So he seemed a natural person to approach to write for us about two of the iconic images of icons of life in southwestern Montana. Obviously, this is the Berkeley Pit. It's a favorite view of mine because you can still see in the lower right corner, there's still parts of Meterville extant. So rather than just show the void of the Berkeley Pit, which in itself is pretty awe-inspiring, we wanted to be able to illustrate the scale of it next to these houses and buildings. Of course, the second icon is the Washoe Stack in Anaconda. And Van chose these two, I guess if you could call the pit a structure, it chose these two structures to illustrate the landscape of power. Obviously, they are tied to the Anaconda Company and ARCO, various permutations through the years, but they also, because of their immense scale, even if you didn't know who owned them, you didn't know who their backstory, you would still be awed and amazed by their presence. Fred Quevick, who some of you might know, was living in Butte at the same time as Brian was, and I think is tremendously responsible for a lot of the initiative that has made Butte the town that it is today in terms of preservation. He's trained as an industrial historian. Today he's an expert witness at different Superfund trials and brings a really interesting background to all of this particular subject matter. So I just threw this up here. This is from his dissertation. And that was one of the things that was so much fun on this, was to bring out work that people had done before, see them update it, and then get the word out there about the dissertations, because as you know, not every dissertation gets published, and there's so much enormous work that goes into them. It's very it's really great to get that information out. So he rewrote chapters of his dissertation which talked about the vernacular landscape. And when we're talking about vernacular, there's the narrow meaning of I guess you could say folkways, for lack of a better word, of people in their everyday lives, everyday people, everyday lives. But it's been expanded by some scholars, such as Del Upton, to encompass now the entire cultural landscape. So that's kind of the way that he was looking at it, because these are obviously not, in this particular image, not vernacular buildings per se. That is, they are not built by an untrained, unschooled person. These are highly technical structures, a highly technical network with train tracks and smokestacks and all of these different buildings that have very specialized meanings. So in Fred's work, he was able to bring that idea of the vernacular industrial landscape into the book, which formed, again, like another basis. This is another landscape of power. I just stuck this in here, again, because of the scale, and to show the wonderful incongruities and seeming contradictions that you find, especially in Butte. You've got a boy with a bicycle, and if you all just saw Butte America, either in the theater or on PBS the other night, you'll know that kids played in tailings all the time, in mine dumps. I mean, cheek by jowl with the gallows frames and everything, and so I thought this was a very illustrative example of those strange incongruities that just hit each other, bounce up each other against each other in Butte. One of the essays that I enjoyed working on perhaps the most is I'm not like a technically minded person, but I had never quite understood what the gallows frame was to do. I sort of got it, but I really didn't. And in researching dissertations, I came across John Mihalich's dissertation on I think it was titled, he was looking at it as a social anthropologist, and it was mostly on Catholicism in Butte, how it tied in with the power structure of the Anaconda Company. But he had this remarkably clear chapter on the gallows frame and what it meant and its context, the men who would maintain them and everything like that. And actually he's featured along with his uncle John T. Shea in Butte, America in the film, talking some about the gallows frame. So I emailed John and asked him if he would consider letting us republish, or publish rather, his this chapter on the gallows frames. And he wrote back and he said, I want to do a whole new chapter. And that was actually pretty indicative of, again, how wonderful it was to work on this project. I mean, anything you could ask somebody to do, even though everybody was way overcommitted in their lives, they would always take the extra step or two to make sure that we were really having a quality contribution to this project. And John was certainly one of those people. He went back into his research and included more transcriptions, more quotes from oral histories that he had done with retired miners during their coffee hour. And so you get not only the technical aspect of the gallows frame and all of that, but you also get the human dimension, which I think combined makes a really powerful statement and stories that you don't easily forget. One that he told is he went climbing up to the top of, I think it was the original mine gallows frame with John T. Shea. And all he was going to do was just like help them with the Christmas lights, change bulbs or something, I can't remember. And he'd grown up in the shadow of the gallows frames, but had never actually really been up on one. And there's a saying, as you're climbing up rung by rung, one for the company, one for me, one for the company, one for me. And so it was great to have that wonderful aphorism included in his essay, that landscape of power and the dichotomy that persists in everything that people do there, and that's physically manifested by these enormous head frames that are so iconic of Butte. One of the other aspects that was really fun for me to explore is I've always been very interested in progressivism. Not so much the political progressivism that people usually think of, but more so what used to be called in the early 20th century as municipal housekeeping. The progressivism, this particular aspect of it, said that you have to teach, it's sort of like Hull House, if you're familiar with Hull House in Chicago. You have to teach the immigrant English, you have to teach them how personal hygiene, as Americans would have. If you have a populace who lives in a beautiful place, they will become better citizens. It really was a propaganda of a sort, but out of this, a lot of the public health movement came as well. So that's sort of, I would say, this aspect of progressivism's legacy. And some of the most complex photographs that I've seen that relate to Butte came from the 1916 sanitary report on the conditions of Butte mines. And then we see here an image from it. These are two fellows who are residents of what was known as Dago Village. Italian fellows, I would surmise. And how this particular project came about was that Butte health authorities realized that there was a very high rate of tuberculosis in Butte. And so they undertook this early public health methodology of identifying, well, first of all, gathering documentation. They went house by house, rooming house by rooming house in specific parts of Butte. They went to the county poor farm, they went down into the mines, they went to the dairies, they went to the garbage dump, they went to a number of different places documenting, gathering data as best they could in the early 20th century on the cubic feet in these these rooming houses, how many miners there were in it. Dave Emmons covers that really well in his book, The Butte Irish. But this was some of the primary source material that talked about it. So the typescript, the scanned typescript of this report has been online with the Montana Memory Project for at least 2 years or so, I would say. But the images, the incredible images that tie back to that specific report had not ever been online. And so with the help and approval of our friends in the photo archives at Montana Historical Society, which is where these photos come from, we were able to include them in the book and also online. Depending on what your perspective is, if you're you know, an urban historian, if you are somebody interested in vernacular architecture, if you are interested in medical history and public health, images like this speak volumes. The number 85 in the upper left corner ties it back to number 85 in the report. And it talked about the outhouses that you can see here. This clearly is a backyard. As many of you probably know, Butte had kind of like dual neighborhoods. You had the houses facing the street, residences facing the street, and then frequently behind, because of the housing crunch that Brian will talk about, you also had people living in the rear of a lot of these urban lots, which, given how close houses are in Butte, and Anaconda, is really quite an accomplishment to stick yet another structure. But you can see by this, I mean, you've got refuse, you've got, it's just kind of a big mess. But you can also tell that this is at the rear of a specific thing. You can also see that they're trying to deal with how you walk through the mud with the board, the really rudimentary boardwalk that is placed down there. And this is one of the most published, actually this image was in Butte America, as I recall, children. Again, and some of those residences that most likely were behind, with the full data that accompanies these particular images in the report. Again, it's just a very fulsome piece of documentation. And that was one of our major aims with this project, was to get all of this primary source material out that had not really been publicized before, or that there was no vehicle to publicize. And by primary sources, what we mean are letters, photographs, newspapers, artifacts, things that were created at the time of their use. So these are just wonderful primary sources, again, that can be read and interpreted any number of ways. One of the most mysterious figures to me that I was really happy to get to include in this particular project was Helen Fitzgerald Sanders, who you see there in the upper left. She was an amazing author, poet, mother. She was a native of Mississippi, and during the Spanish-American War she was in San Francisco and met Louis Fisk Sanders, and they were married and moved to Butte, and she was just an absolute dynamo at publishing, writing poetry. She wrote this is embarrassing for a history major to say, but when I was at a history undergrad, I never realized that the 3-volume History of Montana with the name Sanders on it, this is she. This was written by, I just assumed it was Mr. Sanders, some guy, but it was written by her, and she had 5 children at the time, and this husband that was an attorney. She spent at least one summer up in Glacier Park and was adopted by the Piegan band up there. There's footage apparently of her that was filmed, I can't remember the year exactly, in the park with them, which would be really great fun to find. And she was also a correspondent for a number of national publications, one of them being The Craftsman. The Craftsman was a monthly periodical that was founded by Gustav Stickley, who was at the forefront of the progressive movement in terms of cities, in terms of getting back in touch with nature. And she wrote I want to get the title right because it's such a wonderful title. She wrote an essay on Butte, which is a little bit over the top. I mean, it's your typical, circa 1907 rhetoric, but it's really quite wonderful. The title of her essay in the Craftsman was "Redeeming the Ugliest Town on Earth," and she introduces it, with the belching smokestacks, and you can hear no birds sing, and she talks about its progression from a rude mining camp full of these tumbly down shacks into a city with homes, particularly craftsman homes. And a lot of times today we'll use craftsman as kind of a generic sort of identifier for a specific bungalow architectural type of style, kind of like we do with Kleenex. But in actuality, craftsman houses, such as the interior of this one, there are 3 in Butte, are indeed a very specific type of architecture. And so these craftsman houses were illustrating her essay on redeeming the ugliest town on earth. At some point, in right about 1915, she and Sanders must divorce because she doesn't pop up again in the census until 1930, when she's living in Washington, D.C. Indulge me here for just a second because it's a great story. With a 15-year-old daughter named Daphne Fitzgerald. And I know that there are Sanders descendants. I have yet to contact them. And she also wound up working as the secretary for the Women's Geographical Society, which was founded in answer, it was a proto-feminist answer to the Men's Explorers Club, which would not let women join. And somehow she wound up with them. So, and I visited their headquarters in June, this past June in DC, and they couldn't shed any light on her either. So she's this incredibly prolific, dedicated figure, but she just kind of vanished off the face of the earth. And I just surmise that they got, well, I know they got a divorce because he married later, her husband did, but where does Daphne come from in 1930? So anyway, she's a great mystery, so it was wonderful to be able to really try to highlight some of her contributions to Montana history. Again, I love to bring up this dichotomy, the imbalance in Butte between the very wealthy in terms as is manifested by how they decorate their homes versus, excuse me, those who are not wealthy, particularly the workers. I just threw this image of the Hennessy's building in. One of the 2 essays that I contributed to the project. One grew out of a Bradley Fellowship that I had years ago to the Montana Historical Society, which was going through ledger books looking at the purchases made by Butte workers, many of them miners, in 1910, and then matching up census data with who they were, and running all these different data sets with a relational database and all this stuff. But anyway, it was great fun. And it's so difficult to document what a miner or a worker had in their home because they generally don't keep diaries. They didn't do inventories. I mean, it was a very transient, hardscrabble life. They didn't have many things of comfort around them. But using the data that I had been able to assemble and then analyze, it was fun to turn some general kind of wisdom things on their head. And so I contributed that one. And then I did another one, which was the total end of the spectrum, other end of the spectrum, which was the Butte the Silver Bow Club, which was designed by Lincoln Hare and is still up on Granite Street, with decorations by a Twin Cities furniture designer and interior designer William A. French, who did work from coast to coast. So again, it's kind of that great dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots. So it was a lot of fun for me to be able to do that. This is Burton, the home of Burton K. Wheeler. Chere, do you want to? Chere contributed a great essay on, let's see, what's the title? Montana's smallest NHL. Do you want to just say a few words about it?
of years ago, I was the historian who took the Butte National Historic Landmark and expanded it to include Anaconda. And it was actually not just work that I did, but Derek Strawn did a lot of research and expanded the historical context. And my role was to take the work that many researchers had done on the neighborhoods and the built environment, edit that material so that it could all be layered into an expanded set of documentation about Butte and Anaconda, and then take that back to the National Historic Landmark Program with the goal to expand the designation to include not only copper mining history, but also the labor history of the communities as an area of emphasis, and also to include this Anaconda by virtue of the connection with the Butte-Anaconda Pacific Railroad line, and add that into Butte so that you got this sort of barbell-shaped historic resource. And now it is the largest collection of contributing resources in any historic district that is classified as a National Historic Landmark in the country. Well, in the course of doing that, it jumped out at me that within the NHL for Butte, that was established in 1961, there was a second little NHL that had been designated for Burton K. Wheeler's house after he died. And the Burton K. Wheeler house, the boundary for the NHL, is just the city lots that the house is built on. So it's the smallest, it's kind of a postage stamp size NHL that's contained within this other. And the thing that was really interesting to me about the Burton K. Wheeler house was that this was the place that gave inspiration to Wheeler that I think then went with him to Washington, D.C. when he represented Montana as a populist figure and someone who became very influential on the national scene. He had this experience from Butte that really formed a lot of his positions, and the home itself really embodies that because it's a very typical working class home. In fact, it's even on the larger end of some of the working class houses that you see in Butte, but it's located in a little neighborhood that's surrounded by heavy industry. When you go and stand on 2nd Street where this house is located, it was engulfed by heavy duty iron works and mine yards, and you can see the gallows frames from the yard, and it just is really a symbol for the way that the community, the residential neighborhoods in Butte really just coexisted with the industry that made the whole town go. And so this building became, for me, really interesting because it really kind of placed in a social context the experience of the residents and the workers and people of standing in the community, because there was a very fluid line. When you go to any of the Butte neighborhoods, a lot of mixing happened across social lines and across occupational lines and ethnic lines, and it resulted in a community that has far more integration socially than a lot of other company towns and industrial towns do in the United States. And so I guess that's enough to say about that, because I know we have some other things to talk about, but it was fascinating to me to work on it.
I just love the title. We did have also different contributions to the project about Anaconda, and this is one of my favorite WPA era photographs of workers getting off the trolleys that would convey them from the bottom of the hill to their workplace. And one of the really wonderful things about this project too was not only working with I don't want to say the older, the more senior generation of historians in Montana, like Brian and Chere and me, and Rick and other people, but also to look at the work that emerging scholars and historians are doing. Kate Hampton, for example, did a wonderful essay on the Anaconda Saddle Club, which was just a total revelation to me. I had no knowledge of it whatsoever. That's in the book. And then Matt Basso, who actually was in the, got his master's here at the University of Montana and is now teaching at the University of Utah, took one of the WPA writers, Edward B. Reynolds' short story on his first day of work at the smelter, which just rings with veracity in every single word. You know the way that he's writing it, that he actually experienced these things. And he's got this wonderful description in his short story, Reynolds does, about suiting up to go into the arsenic part of the plant. And it was really wonderful to find this photograph from, I think from the Copper Commandos, series of photographs at the Montana Historical Society's photo archives, and be able to match it up with the part in the short story where he's talking about suiting up for it. Well, a lot of times when you're working on these kind of projects, really weird synchronicity happens, and that was the case with this. Chere mentioned that, or Sue did, that I was worked on the African American Heritage Resources Project for the Historical Society, and so I'm reading along and looking through Matt's essay, which is talking about Edward B. Reynolds' short story, and in terms of the workplace and masculinity, because that's two of his, and World War II. Those are three of his interests and how they mesh together. Well, I kept thinking, I thought, Edward B. Reynolds, that name is so familiar. Well, I went back to the database that we had compiled of census data of black Montanans, and Edward B. Reynolds was black. It was totally through Matt's explanation of the short story into a whole other, and I would say welcome dimension. One of our volunteers actually lived down the street in Anaconda from the Reynolds family, and talked about how light-skinned they were, that they could pass. And indeed, their father Claude was actually a Union steward, but if you go back in the census and you look at his family history, he is unquestionably African American. So it was great fun to be able to make this kind of discovery, and then have Matt do something with it that was really interesting, and that has now, I think, put Reynolds' work into a whole different realm. I think people will look at it a little differently, perhaps, than they did before. One other thing, and it's too bad again that Rick's not here, because excuse me, one of the most, I think, unique things about this publication is that he was very keen on including a portfolio of artistic work in this particular volume. History is all very well, fine and good, but it's interesting to see how artists interpret historic events, historic places. And so we had master photographers such as Roger Whittaker, did an essay on Butte and Anaconda cemeteries. Sister Joanne Daly from Anaconda allowed us to republish, or to publish, some of her mid-1970s prints of Anaconda. And then a wonderful young Butte photographer, Lisa Wareham, who also did the cover for the book, contributed astounding images of Butte that, even if you think you've seen it before, through her eyes, you see it in a whole different sort of way. So that was, the visual arts were very important to it, as was the poetry of Denise Scanlon, Ron Fisher's short story on Magnus Dugan, who was one of the victims in the Speculator mine fire disaster, and left poignant notes for his wife and family behind. And then finally, I just kind of want to finish up. I've been thinking a lot lately, for various reasons, of that marginalized people live in marginal places. And these last few images will uncover a little bit of what I mean. This is the Blue Range brothel on East Mercury, yeah, and it's basically all that's left of Butte's prostitution district, which had an incredibly long and very interesting history. Ellen Baumler, one of our colleagues, who's, I was going to say, she has a special interest in prostitution, but that doesn't sound right. Anyway, as an academic, she has done really wonderful work on the places of prostitution and how they are located within a city, and also their interior arrangement. And you can see here, these are the cribs. I mean, these are the windows where the women would display their wares, if you have it, and then various entryways, and then apartments upstairs. So she did a really wonderful essay for us comparing different types of architecture. The Dumas brothel is just across the street, but that was not originally designed as a brothel. It became one later, but this is a very unique example. And tying again back just briefly to the primary sources idea, the Anaconda Standard, which Dennis Zweibel does a wonderful job of describing how far-reaching it was in terms of the technology and the level of reportage in it, had this 40 or so part series called Queer Spots in and Around Butte. And it's absolutely amazing. I was stunned when I ran across it. It covers everything from like the Chinese gardens, which were gardens out in the flats, to the Assyrian colony, which I'll just briefly talk about, to underground mines, Walkerville, Brown's Gulch, just this huge array of places that people in Butte might be interested in visiting. And a lot of these queer spots in and around Butte were tied to ethnicity. And this is one of the examples. There on the left, you see the Assyrian colony. They were kind of in South Butte, just north of Silver Bow Creek, and it was just this hovel of little buildings. And actually, they were Maronites. I won't get into all the complexities of this particular Turkish life, but our essayist who talks about this particular feature on the Assyrian colony describes it very well. But just fascinating photographs that were made on site. Obviously this is a line drawing, but they also had special line drawings done in this series. And again, these are marginalized people living in marginal places. You can see he's hauling refuse. And that's how he made his living, was as a scrap dealer and a garbage man, basically. And then on the right, you see a Cree Indian wrapped in a blanket with a sign that says "Going to the garbage dump." And Brian, did you just want to? It's Nick Vrooman's essay, but Brian can talk a little bit about it.
I would highly recommend people checking out Nicholas Vrooman's essay on the Cree in Butte. All the years that I studied history in Butte, I'd never run across any of this information. And in 1894, the Cree celebrated a Sundance in Butte down near Marcus Daly's racetrack, which is kind of east of Clark Park. And the Cree remained in Butte for many years. They had several Sundances after the one in 1894. And the Cree people were basically landless and homeless, and after the disappearance of the buffalo in 1883, a lot of them, the last place there were buffalo in Montana was the Judith Basin, and after those animals were gone, the Cree were without a source of food, and they kind of wandered around Montana. On several occasions they were run back into Canada. The Canadians said they didn't want these people. In 1896, there was a Cree Deportation Act passed in Congress, and John Pershing rounded up all the Cree in Montana. I think there were 500 Cree, and loaded them onto boxcars like cattle and shipped them to Canada. The Canadians didn't want these Cree people, and they wandered back across the border. In Butte, apparently they lived at the garbage dump and, scavenged what food they could get, and this continued for many years. There was lots of scathing editorials in the Montana newspapers about these people and the need to get rid of them. And in fact, this whole saga continues today. Today we have the landless Little Shell tribe, Chippewa Cree people, and they petitioned the federal government for the last 20, 30 years to get tribal status. Every time their case comes up before the Department of Interior, it's postponed. It just happened again last week. So this is a legacy we live with yet today.
Yeah, and I think that it shows again, in terms of the sense of place, how we think that we know a place, but I can never now go back to that section of Butte without thinking of these landless people and what they had to endure. The photo in the bottom right is actual Cree people walking in Butte, and the one in the upper left, it's either Butte or it could be Havre, according to Nicholas Fruman. If it is Butte or even Havre, I mean, the idea of a travois in downtown or uptown of either city is pretty amazing to consider. So it was really wonderful to have a scholar like Nick be able to uncover this rich story, which, I mean, a lot of us who thought we knew things really didn't. And it was due to the fact that it was identified as one of the queer spots in and around Butte, the Cree village, as it were, at the garbage dump. So I'm going to close now and turn it over to Brian. It's just going to give you kind of a taste of his wonderful contribution on multifamily housing in Butte.
While Patty gets my PowerPoint set up, I'd just like to give you a little bit of introduction as to how this article of mine came about. In the summer of 1984, I was one of 10 architectural historians who surveyed the National Landmark District. We surveyed over 4,200 buildings, and so that was kind of the genesis of this article. And then I went on to grad school at Bozeman and wrote a paper for Kingston Heath there in architectural history on multifamily housing in Butte. And then when Patty and Rick started working on their publication, and we started planning the vernacular architecture meeting this summer in Butte, I decided to resurrect it and did a bunch more research. So today I'll share a little excerpt with you from my article. Between 1890 and 1916, mining for copper precipitated an unprecedented explosion in Butte's population and an accompanying shortage of housing. Within a brief period of 30 years, the young upstart gold mining camp blossomed into a thriving industrial metropolis, the largest population center between Minneapolis and Spokane. From 1865 to 1895, the wooden false fronts of the Butte Commercial District gave way to a more substantial, permanent architecture of stone and brick. The sense of permanence reflected in the masonry banks, retail stores, and theaters that lined Park and Main Streets was echoed in the new multifamily residences along the perimeter of the central business district. The two-story brick veneered duplexes and fourplexes clustered around the main arterials crisscrossing the Butte Hill represented a solution to a serious housing shortage at the turn of the century and expressed a building form translated to Butte from the east. To better understand the architectural forms that appear in Butte beginning in 1890, it is important to examine multifamily housing as it developed in other industrial cities during the last decades of the 19th century. During the 1870s and 1880s, European immigrants crowded into the eastern seaboard cities of New York and Boston, where they found work in factories and mills. Commonly, the only available housing for these millions of new Americans was the tenement, a dwelling divided into separate spaces for different families. Tenement dwellers faced cramped, unsanitary rooms without adequate light or air. A major housing reform movement inspired by poor working and living conditions in large American cities and the development of an interurban transportation system spawned the creation of suburban residential areas just outside the congested inner city, as well as new housing styles adapted to suburbia. The electric streetcar opened new housing opportunities for middle-class workers' families seeking refuge outside the city center. By 1890, 51 cities boasted electric streetcar systems. By 1895, the number had exploded to 850, and Butte counted itself among these modern cities. Upon arrival in the suburbs, former tenement dwellers sought affordable, home-like environments, which ultimately were provided by housing speculators in the form of three-decker wooden flats and two-story brick flats. Both forms borrowed stylistic elements from the more elaborate Victorian homes of the period, and they provided the tenant with an aura of upward mobility, as well as the amenities of more space, light, air, and a reprieve from the claustrophobic atmosphere of the inner city. Ironically, the industrialization that bred deplorable living conditions within the city also contributed to the accoutrements of suburban life, such as modern plumbing features like porcelain sinks and zinc-lined bathtubs were now available, as were manufactured woodwork detailing for porches and interiors, and higher quality, less expensive bricks to embellish building exteriors. The building forms adapted to these new materials emerged not solely from the drawing boards of professional architects, but also from stock plans and building manuals and from contractors' careful analyses of completed buildings. And this image up on the screen right here is from one of these plan books, William Radford, 1909. Builders in the East and Midwest used several forms that ultimately reappeared somewhat altered some 2,000 miles away in Butte during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. According to Sam Bass Warner in Streetcard Suburbs, the multifamily building forms that appeared in new residential areas surrounding Boston were shaped by several factors, including the size of lots, the high price of land close to the factories and streetcar lines, the popular architectural styles of the day, and the ideas of conservative entrepreneurs reluctant to make risky investments. These speculative builders, including contractors, real estate agents, small business owners, and skilled artisans, tend to repeat a couple of successful styles. He also noted that the simple designs were embellished with bay windows, stained and leaded glass windows, and hardwood floors. Similar factors would eventually influence the style and form of multifamily dwellings in Butte.
Page down.
So here's a map of Butte about 1890 and or 1910, and you can see the various, or I hope you can see the various districts. The area I'm going to focus on today is this area south of Park Street and west of Montana. The city's rural, pristine surroundings could not mask Butte's industrial character. The trappings of industrialism appeared in Butte with the advent of silver mining in the 1870s and the arrival of the railroad in 1881. With the railroad came the necessary building materials, the promise of capital investment, and the cultural baggage containing the memory of an eastern urban landscape, all of which, when combined, would create a modern metropolis at the foot of the Continental Divide. By 1883, the expansion of the copper mining industry caused a great demand for skilled and unskilled wage laborers. Large numbers of newly arrived immigrants from Ireland and Cornwall responded to the call for workers. These early itinerant miners secured housing in wood-frame rooming houses and boarding houses on the north and east side of the central business district, within walking distance of the mines. The largest boarding house, the Mullen House, located in Centerville, which was an unincorporated neighborhood north of the central business district along Main Street. Centerville is up in this area. Let's see, accommodated 200 single miners with several miners sharing the same bed, sleeping in shifts. When miners' families arrived, this form of housing proved inadequate. Inexpensive single-family shotgun houses and four-square workers' cottages ultimately replaced the boarding houses in Centerville and East Butte, an area punctuated by mine shafts and headframes. The rapid expansion of copper mining and ore processing in Butte transformed Butte from a camp to a city in short order. In 1898, 2,500 men worked underground in Butte's 260 underground mines. By 1910, that number had grown to almost 7,000 men in 344 mines. At the same time, more than 5,100 men and 2,600 women supported the industrial workforce in trade, domestic and personal service, professional jobs, public service, and a large clerical contingent. Coincident with the exponential growth of the mining in Butte came a tremendous demand for goods and services, and those employed in this facet of the economy also needed housing. This growing middle-class group of small business owners, retail clerks, secretaries, railroad workers, and skilled craftspeople sought housing within walking distance of work, especially dwellings that offered the modern amenities of electric lights, running water, and central heat. Real estate agents, building contractors, and other perceptive entrepreneurs responded to this demand by constructing functional yet tasteful duplexes and fourplexes close to the service centers of the local economy. Between 1890 and 1920, more than 396 one- and two-story multifamily dwellings sprang up in Butte. These structures can be divided into 5 basic forms or types, each with innumerable variations on a basic theme. The long, narrow lots in Butte facilitated this building form. The functional floor plan repeated itself within this form, with the front door opening into the living room, dining room, which was connected to the kitchen at the rear through a series of arched openings with 2 bedrooms off the living room and the kitchen. The most important form, which we will call the porch-fronted walk-up flat, emerged south and west of the central business district between 1906 and 1916. The wooden 2-story porch represented the primary design feature of these brick veneered fourplexes. The porches, framed by a flat, hipped roof supported by plain wooden posts and balustrade, created a transition space between the interior and the street, an important element of the Gothic Revival cottage. The floor plan constituted a series of arched openings separating the front parlor from the kitchen in the back. The porch-fronted walk-up blended the financial considerations of the owner-builder with the amenities desired by the growing commercial middle class of men and women seeking housing within walking distance of the burgeoning business district. In a 1984 interview, Mary Weldon, the owner of a resident of a porch-fronted walk-up at 647 South Idaho, reflected on the historical importance of providing the modern conveniences of an indoor bathroom, electric lights, a gas cooking range, and hardwood floors to salaried workers while posing little economic risk to the property owner. A front porch provided an exterior space for socializing during the brief Butte summer, while an enclosed back porch provided additional storage. During the first decade of the 20th century, these multifamily dwellings remained within walking distance of the neighborhood grocery, churches, schools, and theaters, as well as the streetcar line. The monthly rent of $20 remained within the means of a clerk earning $70 per month, and Hennessy's department store offered furniture and floor and window coverings for small monthly payments, which Patty has talked about in an article she did on the Hennessy store. This is a Sanborn map of that area. West Galena, there was a heavy concentration of these duplex and fourplexes on West Galena. A profile of owners, builders, and tenants. An examination of Butte city directories and U.S. Census records from 1900 to 1920 provides insight into who built, owned, and lived in the growing number of duplexes and fourplexes built during Butte's transformation into a regional metropolis. in a 3-block area of West Galena within walking distance of the business district. Between 1906 and 1913, 9 two-story brick fourplexes appeared on this one residential street. The owners ranged from the inspector of the Butte Water Company, Met Alexander, to Thomas C. Bowden, a mine engineer at the Mountain View Mine, to Charles Plumley, a contractor. Only one of these men, Plumley, represented both the owner and builder and a resident in the dwelling for a short period. The list of residents over time included car salesmen, miners, a reporter, a clerk of the district court, a bank cashier, and Montana and Butte's only socialist mayor, Lewis Duncan. Between 1911 and 1914, this was Duncan's duplex. Duncan, a Unitarian minister and political activist, lived in this handsome duplex at 704 West Galena during a period of unusual labor unrest in Butte. Another apartment in this complex was rented by Frank Bigelow, editor of the labor newspaper, The Freelance. The largest of the buildings at 910 through 916 West Galena cost its owner and an attorney named Louis Forstall $7,000 to hire contractor William Robertson to build in 1906. A slightly smaller fourplex at 628 West Galena cost H.M. Mullen $4,000 to build in 1912. Carpenters and building contractors, not architects, designed and constructed the Butte brick duplexes and fourplexes. For example, Charles Passmore, who built several of the bay-fronted flats on West Court Street, advertised his services in the Butte Polk directory under real estate, loans, mortgages, civil engineering, and architecture. Passmore arrived in Butte in 1889 on the cusp of the city's emergence as a copper mining center. In 1898, Passmore hired architect George DeSnell, who designed for the firm until 1915, when he set up his own practice. Thomas Angel began working in Butte as a carpenter in 1899, and during the next 20 years built a number of brick walk-up fourplexes south of Park Street and West Silver Street, while residing in the neighborhood. Another carpenter contractor, Charles Elderkin, who lived at 621 South Idaho, constructed a number of porch-fronted flats in an effort to provide alternate living arrangements to houses and apartments. The question remains, however, where these familiar Butte forms came from. Some are reminiscent of brick duplexes and fourplexes found in published plan books from the several decades of the 20th century. William Radford, a Chicago architect and co-owner of the Radford Millworks in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, published a collection of more than 300 designs for houses, bungalows, apartments, and commercial buildings in the 1909 volume Radford's Portfolio of Plans. In the introduction, Radford provides the rationale for investing in a flat. The trend of modern investments is toward income property. It has been found by experience that there is no safer investment than in well-rented real estate. Flats are now equipped with every modern convenience that tends to make life easier and housekeeping a joy and not a drudgery. The exterior design elements and interior floor plans of these two Radford brick flats can be seen in several of the Butte duplexes. Both the Butte flats and Radford plans feature a parlor, 2 bedrooms, a dining room, and a kitchen measuring approximately 1,000 square feet at a constructed cost of between $4,000 and $5,000. Now for the sociology of the Butte fourplex. What economic, environmental, and cultural factors played into the phenomena of the multifamily brick veneered flat emerging in Butte between 1890 and 1916? Most important was the availability and affordability of mass-produced building materials and household appliances. By 1910, common brick was available at both the Butte Sewer Pipe and Tile Company and the Western Clay Company in Helena at a cost comparable to wood-sided structures. Manufactured moldings and hardwood for flooring could be purchased locally at the Big Blackfoot Lumber Company, the J.W. Haggerty Lumber, Largy Lumber, and Western Lumber Company. Porcelain sinks and bathtubs were sold at 5 firms in Butte and 9 businesses, including Hennessy's, Lander Furniture, and South Butte Hardware, which offered electric and gas ranges for the kitchens. Butte also had tradespeople to do the building and finishing of these fourplexes. At the time, Butte advertised 72 brick and stone masons, 93 building contractors, 144 electricians, 17 plasterers, and 90 plumbers. An equally important economic factor playing into the development of the fourplex design was the rapid expansion of the Butte middle class as the city transformed itself into an industrial mining metropolis. The thousands of underground miners and their families needed goods and services, which were provided by thousands of clerks, managers, and professionals. At the same time, thousands of women expanded their occupational choices beyond teaching, nursing, and domestic work into the commercial world of sales and secretarial work. These battalions of middle-class men and women demanded more modern housing for their families, and the brick duplex and fourplex met their needs. The high value of land within the original Butte town site helped promote the development of multifamily housing on narrow city lots. The proximity of these lots to the central business district and the Butte streetcar system, which was electrified in 1890, made them attractive to men and women working within walking or riding distance. In the mill towns of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, ethnicity and occupation played a significant role in who occupied the multifamily dwellings. But in Butte, a person's nationality or line of work rarely mattered. The neighborhoods where we find the brick duplexes and fourplexes are not Dublin Gulch, Corktown, or Little Italy. A person's middle-class status played a central role in defining the tenants of these fourplexes on West Galena Street in 1910 and again in 1930. For example, in 1910, the fourplex at 738 West Galena housed a cashier at the newspaper, a clothing merchant, the assistant manager of the electric light company, a lawyer, and a department store clerk. That same dwelling in 1930 was home to a mine engineer, a School of Mines instructor, a dressmaker, and assistant manager of the local furniture store. None of these residents shared a country of origin, but all shared a place in Butte's growing middle class, and most had families. These tenants were also influenced like never before by the mass media of newspapers and magazines, providing an ever more important glimpse into the world of consumer goods and lifestyles found from Philadelphia to Minneapolis to Denver to Butte. Although the popularity of the duplex and fourplex continued through the second decade of the 20th century, after 1906, apartment living made inroads in Butte. Between 1906 and 1917, more than a dozen apartment buildings, some as tall as 6 stories, dotted the skyline of Butte. With World War I came a tremendous demand for copper, spawning a workforce of 15,000 miners underground in Butte. A dire shortage of affordable, modern housing emerged. Butte builders responded by erecting large apartment buildings, such as the Leonard and the Muller on West Granite, and the Napton on East Granite across from Hennessy's. With Butte's dominance of the world copper market in the 1890s, the newly formed city took on an urban industrial character of eastern cities like Providence and Pittsburgh. A convergence of mass-produced building materials, appliances, mass media, and a growing middle class familiar with the amenities of life found east of the Mississippi River created a cityscape unique to Montana. Architecturally and culturally, Butte looked nothing like its neighboring cities of Missoula, Bozeman, and Helena, and the 2-story brick walk-up flats played an essential role in Butte's architectural, cultural, and economic transformation from an upstart silver camp to an industrial city. Thank you.
Well, Butte and Anaconda are communities that deeply understand the importance of their heritage and the connection of the people of the communities to that heritage is really striking. For years, there have been historians and community members, just your average person on the street, who understand and continue to pursue new information about the history of these communities. And the thing that's really striking now is that since 1981 and the closure of Anaconda and the kind of post-industrial period, the city-county government has staked its identity in large ways on preservation of uptown Butte and the heritage of the built environment. And the city of Anaconda has done many of those same kinds of things. We were really fortunate to be able to work on this project. We were really fortunate that there are so many historians who have loved Butte and Anaconda for so long. People like Brian, Mary Murphy, Dave Edmonds. There's just kind of a star-studded cast that looked at Butte's history. Patty's essays are just really exceptional in the ways that everyday accoutrements of living in Butte tell a huge story about the experience of people who were there during its heyday. And so we really encourage you all to take a look at the book online, and the volume is for sale here in the lobby, of course. And we just think that, just when you believe that there can't be anything more said about these communities, it's really remarkable how under every stone there's something new. And I think that the expansion of the Butte Silver Bowl Public Archive that's underway right now, Ellen Crane and her staff just have done some tremendous work to not only uncover new stories, but to be the repository that holds those stories in place and continues to celebrate them. And if there's one thing about Butte and Anaconda that you realize when you go there, it's that on any given day, you might see school kids researching their genealogy, you might run into international scholars who are here looking at labor history, you might run into Irish people who are there to inquire whatever happened to their relatives who came to Butte and never made it back to the home country. And all those stories are just ingrained in the culture there. And so this book was really a joy to work on, and we're just really fortunate to be in company of all these people, including Rick Newby, who's not here today, to bring that forward to you. And we do have probably about 15 minutes if people have questions or want to talk about some interesting aspects of Butte and Anaconda history that you know about that nobody's written up yet.
What was Burton Wheeler's position when he was living in the house that he was with?
He was, Burton K. Wheeler was an attorney, first in private practice there, and then the U.S. attorney appointed for that district. And he lived in the home until he was elected to become a senator, and then kept the home during the time that he was living in D.C. and representing Montana. The interesting thing is that he kept that house and he returned to Butte regularly, and when he did, connecting back to people in the neighborhood was very consciously, he talks about this in his memoir, a way for him to connect back to the people who he represented, but also to connect back to sort of the values and the lifeways of Butte that were very much part of his philosophy on egalitarianism and the importance of the working class to kind of on an equal footing to the community representation. He lived in a much bigger house once he moved to DC. Other questions? Carly?
The map that you showed, Brian, with the duplexes, what were the little boxes like the back of the house? I thought they had indoor plumbing, but it looked like they were like little, or were those little
They might have
houses?
been little sheds, and like I said, most of these buildings had both a front porch and a back porch. A lot of those back porches were kind of enclosed and people would use them for storage. But there were little sheds in the back of a lot of them. And I'm just amazed at how many of those buildings are extant. Unfortunately, lots of them are abandoned, but the one shot, I did show one that's kind of under construction. They were redoing it, and there are people living in a lot of them, but there are a lot of abandoned buildings, especially in South Central Butte. Yes?
I was going to ask, how is the preservation progressing down there? Is there interest, or is
I think Butte looks better today than it's looked since I lived there. I mean, there's lots of places that have been fixed up. Unfortunately, lots of them aren't rented. I mean, you walk around uptown Butte, and like on a Saturday afternoon or evening, and at times it almost feels like a ghost town. Pat Williams gave a wonderful introduction to the Butte America film when they premiered it in Helena. He talked to his parents had a restaurant cafe there on Park Street called, I think it was called the American Candy Company or something. He was like 7 or 8 years old and remembers coming down out of the restaurant at 2 a.m. after his parents closed up, and there being so many people on Park Street that his parents would hang on to his hand. They were afraid he'd just be carried away at 2 a.m. on Saturday night in Butte. And unfortunately, I never saw Butte until the 1970s, but even in the 60s, I think that uptown was still a pretty vibrant, happening place. All the underground mines closed, I think, in 1974, and that meant a huge decline in the workforce. The current mining operations in Butte, MRI, Washington, Inc., that mine and concentrator is operated by 300 men. And like I said, in 1917, there were 15,000 men working underground. Butte was the intersection of five continental railroads. So it was an incredibly busy place, you know, a huge warehouse district. And maybe Chere could speak to current preservation efforts.
We work a lot with local community efforts in Butte and Anaconda, and certainly the city-county is to be credited for just recognizing the importance of a lot of the resources there. It's a huge and overwhelming kind of problem to not only preserve the neighborhoods, but you know, where there's like subsidence underground, you've got lots of different issues that other communities may not have, and then there's also the whole question about the cleanup after the mining and the stabilization of the mine yards and stuff. But you know, the city-county has acquired most all the mine yards now. They have been working really hard to stabilize the buildings there, and they understand that not only are those symbols of the community, but they're also kind of the centerpiece to each little neighborhood. And so that's underway. John Sesso, Dory Skrukrud, others in the planning department have been working at this for decades. And then you've got the local nonprofit Butte CPR that's just really committed tons of volunteer hours to not only working to be a voice for preservation, but salvaging materials from buildings that can't be saved, issuing little grants out of that pool of money to help encourage the preservation of other buildings. And so, you know, there's a local effort to not only preserve these things, but then to build on that as sort of a platform for heritage and interpretation and a tourism economy that can be happening in Butte. I think, you know, from year to year it really changes, but uptown they've been pretty successful. It's certainly come a long way from the years in the 1980s when the fire department was burning down buildings to have practice projects. And then, you know, I don't want to leave Anaconda out because Anaconda's had a really important historic preservation program for a long time. Connie Daniels, Cheryl McKinley, and others have worked to preserve some of the important icons in Anaconda, making the Washoe smelter stack a state park, and doing a lot of interpretive work over there has been important. But when we took this whole project to, Ellen Crane and I took this project to expand the NHL to DC for the National Review, it was amazing to describe what was still there, you know, but it was also kind of a daunting question that the review committee even raised, you know, well, okay, so we're really happy to give you this designation because it will help raise the profile, but we still are concerned that all of this historic and industrial legacy is at risk. And so it continues, but they continue to work away at it. And I think, you know, given the scope and the scale of what it all is, they're doing a great job.
I think we have to continue outside. Yeah.
Okay, maybe one last question? Yeah, sure.
I was just wondering if anybody's written about the boarding houses of Butte.
Not to my,
No,
not to my knowledge, no.
That's a big chunk also of knowledge. Yeah.
And just trying to uncover the source material for something like that would be difficult, you know, unless we can find some people that operated those, you know, get some oral histories, but a lot of that kind of information is hard to come by, but it would certainly be great to explore that.
Well, thanks everybody, and we will be out in the hall and happy to talk more about this. Thank you.